Maybe getting used to seeing it. President-elect Donald Trump making foreign policy announcements and pronouncements on Twitter. But some liberals are warning those tweets could be dangerous, especially the ones about nuclear arms. So will Mr. Trump keep up the tweets when he takes office? Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich had this to say yesterday on Fox News Sunday.
On the tweeting thing, let me just suggest, if I might, we might as well get used to it. This is who he is. It's how he's going to operate, whether it's brilliant or stupid. He beat 16 rivals, then he beat Hillary Clinton, and he beat the elite media. He ain't giving it up.
Do you think it's brilliant or stupid?
I think it's brilliant.
Some arms control experts are issuing dire warnings that Mr. Trump's tweets could help unleash a nuclear catastrophe. But is that a giant overreaction? Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, a nuclear non-proliferation expert, try to say that quickly a few times, at the Middlebury Institute, joins us live. We really appreciate you coming in, especially on a holiday week. Good to see you.
It's fun to be here.
Now, Dr. Lewis, I gather, I've been reading closely, I listened to your podcast, that part of your case rests on the idea that President-elect Trump is rash and jumps to conclusions.
Well, I mean, I don't think he picks his words very carefully. It may be that there is some careful thinking behind some of the things he says, and I will tell you, I think people are often just as rash in interpreting them as he is in issuing them. But yeah, I don't think he's all that careful with language, and that's new territory for a president.
That is new territory, but I want to ask you about that. You say he's not careful with language. You were quoted in the Washington Post saying, quote, "If he recklessly tweets, people could read these things in the worst possible light. Do North Koreans have a plan to use nuclear weapons very early in a conflict? They're not going to wait around. If they think they're going to use nuclear weapons against South Korea and Japan." Aren't you jumping to conclusions a little bit there? I know there's all kinds of studies saying that might be what North Korea does, but you're saying he could tweet and the world could explode.
Well, look, in peacetime, it's fine. I mean, he can make a joke about killing Kim Jong-un, and I don't think anything's going to happen because it's peacetime, right? The scenario that I worry about, or at least one of them, is when there is a crisis, right? And that there is already a situation in place where things are very touch and go. And, you know, Trump has joked about having Kim Jong-un killed. And I just, you know, my experience with the North Koreans is they don't find that at all funny. And if we're in a situation where the North Koreans are looking for a sign that an attack is going to come, they might read that into it. So, you know, I'm not so crazy about the tweets.
They could read that. On the other hand, there are others who think that we overread Kim Jong-un and that he's just a tubby tyrant. And yes, he has nukes and we need to be careful, but his bark is bigger than his bite.
So I think that may also be true, but ultimately that still bothers me because, you know, we're sitting here having this discussion about whether we read them correctly, whether they read us correctly, whether we're overinterpreting Trump's tweets, whether we're underinterpreting them. And I think what that really illustrates, at least to me, is that human beings are fallible. And, you know, in a crisis, if you're not incredibly careful with language, you run the risk of somebody making mistakes. So it's kind of like, doesn't matter who's right, who's wrong, doesn't matter if people are not really hearing what Trump says. And by the way, I think they don't really hear what he says. I think often people misinterpret the tweets. But, you know, at the end of the day, you cause a nuclear war, you can't blame the media for that.
So maybe you just, in the Washington Post, you and others were talking about hypotheticals, because I mentioned, I listened to your podcast to do my homework. November 22nd, you said, among other things, quote, "We are probably not all going to die in a nuclear war," that you kind of thought some of this was exaggerated. So I guess my question is, are the critics of Donald Trump exaggerating the threat somewhat? Because you're much more of an expert than I am on all of this. I listened to your podcast on November 22nd, and you suggested some of this may just be hype.
Well, look, we live in an incredibly polarized society, so I have no doubt that some of the people who are reacting are definitely exaggerating things. On the other hand, for those of us who work in the nuclear business, language is a really important thing because people are constantly signaling. And so, you know, for those of us who work in this business, to hear politicians discussing nuclear weapons, it's always pretty terrifying. And then to see someone making what I think are careless word choices is pretty off-putting. I mean, I actually agree with Newt Gingrich. He is who he is. I just wish maybe we could convince him not to tweet about nuclear weapons.
Last question. What do you make, then, of Donald Trump, what he said throughout the campaign, and he said it now during the transition, that he sees it as a strength that he's unpredictable. That you might find it dangerous, others might find it dangerous, and it may be. I'm not discounting, you're an expert on this, I'm not discounting that. But on the other hand, unpredictability, he says, could be an asset against a dictator like Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, that's a giant debate in the strategic community that we're probably not going to settle on television. I would just say, from my perspective, nuclear weapons are the worst possible threat we could face. And so, while there is some advantage to unpredictability, I like nice, plain, old, boring stability.
Well, one thing we're not getting from Donald Trump, you and I can agree, is plain and boring. And I agree with you that nuclear business is serious business, and we appreciate you treating this subject seriously tonight and coming on.